My father wore his only good suit that day, the navy one he'd had since my cousin's confirmation 12 years earlier, let out twice at the waist by my mother's own hand because we never had the money to buy a new one when the old one still buttoned. He stood at the edge of the reception hall holding a glass of sparkling cider he hadn't touched, and he kept smoothing the lapel with his thumb, the way he does when he's trying not to look like he doesn't belong somewhere. That's the detail I keep coming back to. Not the toast. Not the words. Just my father's thumb on that lapel, over and over, like he could iron the poverty out of the fabric if he pressed hard enough. The boundary my husband's family crossed that night was one they didn't even know existed, because they had never once, in 2 years of knowing me, asked my parents a single question about themselves. That was the line. Not an insult, not a slur, just erasure, dressed up as good manners, and I let it happen for 2 years before I decided I would not let it happen at my own wedding. My name is Renata Alves. I'm 31, I live in Sacramento, and until 8 months ago I worked as a project coordinator for a mid-sized construction firm, which is, if you want the honest version, how I met the man who is now my husband. I was born in this city, in the same neighborhood my parents still live in an apartment 2 miles from the one I grew up in. My father, Tomas, came north from a small town outside Oaxaca when he was 19, with almost nothing, and worked his way up over 30 years from laborer to foreman, building the kind of housing that people like the family I was about to marry into would never think to live in and would also never think to ask about. My mother, Elena, came a few years after him, and has cleaned houses in the wealthier parts of this city for as long as I can remember, coming home every evening with her hands raw and her stories careful, curated for a daughter she didn't want to burden with the specifics of what her days actually cost her. I should start with how I met the man who became my husband, and how his family received the news of our engagement, because the order matters, because nothing that happened at that reception came from nowhere, and I don't want you to think I woke up one day and decided to make a scene. I want you to understand exactly how long I sat quietly at that family's table, saying nothing, absorbing small erasure after small erasure, before I finally didn't. I was the coordinator on a permitting project for a boutique hotel renovation downtown, and Desmond Whitfield was the client-side liaison, the second son of a family that owned, among other things, 3 hotels, a vineyard in Napa that I have still never been invited to, and a habit of speaking about money the way other people speak about weather, a fact of life, unremarkable, always present. We met over blueprints and inspection schedules, in a conference room with bad coffee, and what I remember most about those early weeks isn't romantic at all. It's that he was the only person in that firm who asked me where I grew up and then actually listened to the answer, instead of using the pause to talk about himself. He asked about my parents by the 3rd week. He asked their names by the 5th. He remembered, months later, that my mother made pastelitos on Sundays, and the first time he came to our apartment for dinner, he ate 3 of them and asked my mother, in the broken, earnest Spanish he'd been quietly practicing, if she'd teach him the recipe. I fell for him in that kitchen, watching my mother laugh at his accent, watching my father, usually reserved with strangers, pour him a second glass of the cheap wine we kept for guests. I want to be fair to Desmond in the telling of this, because none of what came later was really his doing. He loved my parents. He still does. The problem was never him. The problem was the people who raised him. There was a ritual that formed almost immediately between the 3 of them, one I didn't fully register as a ritual until much later, when I understood how rare it actually was. Every other Sunday, Desmond would show up at my parents' apartment an hour before dinner, not for me, I was usually still finishing a work call, but for my father, who would be out on the little concrete patio checking the oil in whatever second-hand truck he was fixing that month. Desmond would hand my father tools before he even asked for them. He learned the names of things. He learned that my father took his coffee with too much sugar and pretended not to notice when my mother rationed it. He learned, within 3 months, more about the daily texture of my parents' lives than his own family had bothered to learn in the 2 years since. I remember the project at work stretching longer than either of us expected, and how much of our courtship actually happened in that conference room with the bad coffee, over permit applications and inspection reports, Two people finding each other in the unglamorous middle of a job neither of us thought was romantic until it suddenly was. He would stay late to help me finish paperwork that wasn't his to finish. I would bring him pastelitos my mother had made, wrapped in a dish towel, and watch him eat them at his desk like they were the best thing he'd had all year, which, some weeks, I think they were. It's strange to look back now and realize that the version of him I fell in love with, patient, curious, unimpressed by his own name, was entirely real, and entirely separate from the family that had made him. That contradiction is, I think, the whole shape of this story. I met his mother, Corinne Whitfield, for the first time at a restaurant with white tablecloths and a wine list that had no prices on it, which I have since learned is its own kind of message. She was gracious in the specific way that certain women are gracious, a compliment on my dress that somehow also noted it wasn't a label she recognized, a question about my job that was really a question about my prospects, a smile that never quite reached the eyes. Desmond's father, Harlan, said very little and watched a lot, and his older brother, Preston, spent most of dinner on his phone, looking up only to ask me, apropos of nothing, whether Alves was Portuguese or Brazilian, and then losing interest before I finished answering. There was a specific ritual that formed over those first years, one I only understood the shape of in hindsight. Every time our two families were in the same room, the Whitfields would ask a single polite, surface-level question about my parents, what my father did for work, whether my mother had always lived in Sacramento, and then, no matter what I answered, the conversation would pivot, gently and completely, back to something Whitfield-shaped. Preston's promotion. Corinne's charity gala. The Vineyard's new bottling. It happened so smoothly, so many times, that for a long while I told myself I was imagining a slight where there was only a difference in conversational style. Rich people talk about their own lives more, I told myself. It isn't personal. It's just what confidence sounds like when you've never had to justify your existence to anyone. A coworker of mine, a project manager named Fatima who'd sat in on one of the rare occasions Corinne visited our office to see the renovation in progress, pulled me aside afterward at the coffee station. She hadn't been looking for gossip. She said it almost apologetically, like she wasn't sure it was her place. Your future mother-in-law asked me 3 questions about the marble supplier and never once asked what you actually do here, she said. I run the whole coordination side of this project, I told her, a little defensive on Corinne's behalf even then. Fatima just shrugged and said, I know. I told her that. She said, how nice, and asked me if I knew a good florist. I laughed it off in the moment, the way you do, and told Fatima she was reading too much into small talk. But I carried the exchange around with me for days afterward, the way you carry around a splinter you've decided isn't worth digging out yet. There were other moments in that stretch I filed away without examining too closely at the time. A birthday dinner for Desmond where Harlan spent 20 minutes describing a hunting trip to Wyoming and never turned once to ask my father, sitting 2 seats away, whether he'd ever been hunting, whether he even liked the outdoors, whether he had stories of his own from the small ranching town outside Oaxaca where he'd grown up before his family came north, a town, I later learned from my father in a rare unguarded moment, that Harlan would have found fascinating if he'd only asked. At charity gala Corinne invited us to where she introduced my parents to her friends as Desmond's fiancé's family, never using their names, though she'd had 2 years to learn them. Small things. Deniable things. The kind of thing you can tell yourself doesn't add up to a pattern, right up until you're forced to count them all at once. My mother noticed it before I let myself admit it. She mentioned it once, in the car after that first dinner, carefully, the way she raises anything she doesn't want to seem like she's complaining about. They didn't ask your father what he does, she said. I told them, I said he's a foreman. They didn't ask what that means, she said. They didn't ask what he builds. I remember telling her she was reading too much into a first dinner. I remember believing that, mostly, because I wanted to. The engagement happened at Christmas, in front of both families, and it is one of the 2 or 3 moments in this whole story I can still watch clearly, like a scene from someone else's life. Desmond got down on one knee in my parents' small living room, in front of the plastic tree my mother has had since I was 9, and asked me in front of everyone, and my father, who does not cry, who I had seen cry exactly once before, at his own mother's funeral, had to leave the room for a minute to compose himself. When he came back in, Harlan Whitfield shook his hand, congratulated him, essentially, on the marriage his son was making, and said, with what I now understand was meant kindly, "Well, this is quite a step up for the family, isn't it?" He meant Desmond's family. He said it looking at my father. My father just nodded, because what do you say to that, in your own living room, on the happiest night of your daughter's life? You let it go. You let it go because making a scene costs you something you can't get back, and my parents have spent their whole lives calculating what things cost. I confronted Desmond about it, quietly, in the car that night. It's the closest thing to a real argument we had in our whole engagement. I told him what his father said. He went pale, and he said the thing people say when they're choosing loyalty to their family's comfort over confrontation with their family's behavior. That's just how my dad talks. He doesn't mean anything by it. I let that sit between us for a long moment before I said, carefully, that meaning something by it and having an effect were two different things, and the effect had been my father leaving his own living room to cry where no one could see him. Desmond apologized. He meant it. But he didn't say anything to his father, not that week, not the next, and I understood, without either of us naming it, that there was a version of confrontation Desmond was willing to have with me, in private, and a version he was not yet willing to have with his own family, in front of them. That was the deniable moment, the kind you can talk yourself out of if you want to keep the peace, and God, for 2 years, I wanted to keep the peace. My best friend Odalise was the one who finally asked me the direct question, at my bridal shower of all places, pulling me into the kitchen while Corinne's gift, a crystal decanter set worth more than my father makes in 2 weeks, sat unopened on the table. "Does it bother you," Odalise asked, "that they've never once asked your mom a real question about her life? Not what she does. Who she is." I deflected. I said something about how families are just different, how the Whitfields weren't warm people by nature, how it wasn't personal. Odalise looked at me the way she does when she thinks I'm lying to myself more than to her, and said, "Okay," and let it go, because that's what good friends do when you're not ready yet. But she'd planted something. I carried that question around for months after, turning it over. There was a second test of the boundary, months after the dinner where my mother's hands went still over her cleaning house's confession, and it came at an engagement party thrown by Preston's wife, in their backyard, under string lights that probably cost more than my parents' monthly rent. My father had brought a bottle of the mezcal he keeps for special occasions, the good kind, the kind he only opens twice a year, meaning to offer it to Harlan as a gesture, one host's good bottle to another. Harlan accepted it with a polite thank you, set it on a side table, and never opened it that night, choosing instead to pour from the labeled selection of scotch he'd laid out for his own guests. It was such a small thing. It would have taken nothing, one glass, one toast, one moment of choosing my father's gift over his own curated bar, and Harlan didn't do it, and I watched my father notice him not do it, and say nothing, and refill his own glass instead from the same bottle he'd brought, quietly, alone, at the edge of the patio. I could have said something to Harlan that night. I stood there with the words half-formed and let them go unsaid, telling myself it wasn't worth the awkwardness of a party, telling myself my father didn't seem bothered, when the truth was I simply didn't know yet how to have that fight and still walk back into that house afterward as Desmond's fiancée. I want to be honest about my own theories during that stretch, because I never had certainty, only guesses, the way you do about people who never say the true thing directly. My theory, most days, was that Corinne genuinely believed she was being polite, that in her world, dwelling on someone's modest circumstances was itself the rudeness, and steering away from it was a kindness. My other theory, on worse days, was that she simply didn't think my parents' lives contained anything worth asking about. I never resolved which one was true. I'm not sure I've resolved it even now. The specific, plainly stated reason nothing broke apart sooner was this: my father would not let me make it his fight. That was his line, drawn early and never crossed, no matter how much I pushed against it. "You are marrying their son," he told me once, in his slow, deliberate way, "not his family. Don't burn a house down over a smell you don't like." He'd built his whole life on not giving people reasons to say he'd overreacted, on being the steady one, the reliable one, on his job sites and in his own home. My mother had her own version of the same restraint. She would go quiet, polite, smaller in Corinne's presence, and I hated watching her do it, and I understood exactly why she did. There was one dinner, 8 months before the wedding, where Corinne asked my mother, finally, directly, what she did for work, and my mother said, simply, "I clean houses," and there was a half-second of silence at that table that I will never forget. A silence that had a shape to it, and then Corinne said, "How wonderful to have such flexible hours," and moved on to the flower arrangements for the wedding, and my mother's hands went still in her lap for the rest of the meal. My father reached under the table and took her hand. Neither of them said a word. That was the test, the moment where the boundary could have been crossed, where I could have said something, right there, in front of everyone, and I didn't. I told myself it wasn't the right moment. I told myself I was protecting the wedding. I have thought about that silence more than almost anything else in this whole story. The months that followed changed the shape of things without changing the substance. Wedding planning has a way of doing that. It puts everyone in rooms together constantly, but it channels every interaction into logistics, so you can go weeks feeling close to people while learning almost nothing new and true about them. Corinne took over more of the planning than I'd agreed to. In the polished, unstoppable way she did everything, and I let her, partly out of exhaustion and partly, I think now, out of a kind of magical thinking. If I let her have the wedding she wanted, maybe she'd finally decide my family belonged in it. I told myself that during this stretch, that this was simply what it looked like when two very different families merged, that once the wedding was behind us, once we were just Desmond and Renata instead of two colliding worlds, it would settle. I believed, or made myself believe, that Corinne's coldness toward my parents was a surface thing, weather, not climate. I would understand, only much later, how wrong that belief was, and how much of it I'd built to make the next 6 months bearable. Odalise asked me, during that stretch, whether I was excited or just exhausted, and I remember not having a clean answer. I was excited about Desmond. I was exhausted by the constant, low-grade work of managing two families toward a single day, translating between two entirely different vocabularies of care, my mother's, which showed up as extra food no one asked for and worry disguised as questions about the weather, and Corinne's, which showed up as vendors and deposits and a florist on retainer, and never once, in all those months, as a direct question about who my parents actually were. The seating chart was where I finally learned the thing that broke my understanding open, 3 weeks before the wedding, in a conversation I wasn't supposed to overhear. I'd come to the Whitfield house to finalize table assignments, and I walked in through the side door while Corinne was on a call with the wedding planner in the next room, her voice pitched at that particular register people use when they think they're alone. She was discussing the head table. "No, not next to my sister, obviously," she was saying. "Put her parents somewhere sensible. Table 11, maybe, with the Kowalskis, they won't mind, they're, down-to-earth people. It's fine, they'll be comfortable there. We just don't want anyone from the firm seated near them. It's a small world and Harlan's business partners don't need to be making conversation about," and here she paused, choosing her words even in private, even to a wedding planner she was paying, about cleaning services, or whatever it is exactly that she does. I stood in that hallway for a long moment with my hand still on the doorframe. Table 11 wasn't just a placement. It was a decision about who my parents were allowed to be seen as, made by a woman who had spent 2 years polishing her own manners into something so smooth it never once had to say the ugly thing directly, until the one time she thought no one was listening. I didn't walk in. I didn't confront her that day. I drove home and sat in my car outside my parents' apartment for 40 minutes before I could make myself go inside and act normal at dinner, because I hadn't decided yet what I was going to do with what I'd just learned, and I didn't want my mother to see it on my face before I had. I want to describe what those 40 minutes actually felt like, because I think it's the truest part of this whole story. It wasn't rage, not at first. It was a kind of vertigo, the sensation of watching 2 years of memory rearrange themselves in real time. I thought about every dinner where Corinne had asked my mother one polite question and pivoted away. I had always assumed, charitably, that the pivoting was clumsiness, an inability to sustain a conversation about a life so different from her own. Sitting in that car, I understood it wasn't clumsiness at all. It was management. She had been managing my parents' presence in her world the entire time, the way you manage a minor inconvenience you've decided to tolerate rather than a family you've decided to welcome. Table 11, the Kowalskis, keep them away from Harlan's business partners. None of that was an accident of a harried planning session. It was a policy, applied consistently, for 2 years, so gently that I'd never once had to feel its full weight until I heard it stated plainly to a stranger on the phone. I thought, too, about my father's mezcal sitting unopened at the edge of Harlan's patio, and my mother's hands going still over her own admission, and Preston's half-interested question about our name, and I understood, sitting in that car, that none of it had been isolated after all. It had been a pattern the entire time, one I had refused to name because naming it would have cost me something, the fantasy that my two families could simply blend, given enough time and enough patience on my part. I had been the one paying for that peace, all along, in the currency of my own parents' quiet dignity, and I hadn't even fully realized I was spending it. When I finally went inside, my mother asked what was wrong the moment she saw my face, the way mothers do, and I told her it was nothing, work stress, and she let me have the lie because she could tell I needed it for a little while longer. I sat at that dinner table, eating the same food I'd eaten 100 times before, watching my parents laugh about something small and unremarkable, and I felt the whole architecture of the last 2 years settle into a shape I could finally see clearly, and could no longer pretend not to. I told Desmond that night, and to his credit, this time was different. He didn't defend his mother. He went quiet, and then he said, "Lo, I'll fix the seating." I told him that wasn't the point, that fixing a seating chart wasn't the same as fixing what she believed about my family, and he didn't have an answer for that, because there wasn't a good one. We sat with it a while, the two of us on the edge of our bed, neither of us reaching for the other the way we usually did when a hard conversation ended. I told him about the mezcal, about the Kowalskis, about Fatima and the florist, laying it all out in order for the first time, not as isolated complaints but as the pattern I'd finally allowed myself to see. I watched something in his face change as I spoke, not surprise, exactly, more like the specific discomfort of a person realizing he'd had all the same information I had, for just as long, and had simply organized it differently in his own head, filed it under family quirks instead of what it actually was. I asked him, directly, for the first time in our whole relationship, whether he thought his mother looked down on my parents. He sat with that question a long time before he answered, and when he did, his answer was honest in a way I respected even though it hurt. "I think she doesn't know how not to. I don't think she'd ever say it's what she believes. But yeah. I think it's what she believes." He rubbed his hands over his face and added, quieter, "I think I've spent my whole life letting her not say it out loud, because it was easier than making her. I didn't realize what that cost until you just laid it out like that." That was the closest either of us came to naming it plainly, and even then, neither of us said the word snob, or worse, out loud. We didn't need to. We both knew what we meant. "What do you want to do?" he asked me finally, and I told him the truth, which was that I didn't fully know yet. I told him I didn't want a war with his family. I told him I didn't want my wedding to become a referendum on his mother's character. But I told him, too, that I was done accepting quiet as the price of peace, and that whatever happened next, I needed him standing where I was standing, not somewhere safely in between. He said he would. It was the first promise in our relationship I wasn't sure, in that moment, he'd actually be able to keep. I would find out, 3 weeks later, that he could. I revisited, in the days after that, every one of those 2 years of small deniable moments with new eyes, my father's lapel smoothing at the engagement dinner, my mother's stilled hands over her cleaning house's confession, Preston's half-interested question about our last name, Harlan's quite a step-up comment that I had let go in my parents' own living room. None of them had been isolated. They'd been a pattern the whole time, and I had spent 2 years calling it weather when it had always been climate. I want to tell you what I decided, and how I decided it, because I did not want revenge, not really, not even in the moment I'm about to describe. What I wanted was for my parents to be seen, once, in front of the people who had spent 2 years quietly deciding they weren't worth seeing. I thought about pulling Corinne aside privately before the wedding and telling her what I'd overheard. I thought about that for 2 full days. I decided against it, in the end, not because I was afraid of her, but because I understood, finally and completely, that a private conversation was exactly the kind of thing she was counting on. The same unspoken agreement that had kept my parents quiet at that dinner table, that had kept my father composing himself in another room, that had kept 2 years of small erasures small. I decided that if the disrespect was going to happen in public, disguised as etiquette, then the correction was going to happen in public too, disguised as nothing at all, as simply the truth, said once, plainly. At the one moment no one could pivot away from it. The wedding was in October, at a vineyard that was not the Whitfields but might as well have been, given how thoroughly Corinne had shaped every detail of it. My mother wore a dress she'd had made by a seamstress 2 blocks from her apartment, a deep wine red that made her look, I thought, more beautiful than anyone else in that entire venue, and my father wore the navy suit, let out at the waist, lapel smoothed flat by his own thumb before we'd even gotten out of the car. I watched them find table 11 without complaint, sitting down among strangers with the same quiet dignity they'd carried through every slight of the last 2 years, and something in me settled into a kind of calm I hadn't expected. I wasn't angry anymore, exactly. I was clear. The toasts came near the end of the dinner, after the meal, before the dancing, the way they always do. Desmond's best man first, funny and warm, then my maid of honor, Odalise, who made half the room cry talking about the 2 of us, and then, because Corinne had insisted on it weeks earlier, over my quiet objection, a toast from the mother of the groom. She stood with a champagne flute, radiant in the way women like Corinne always are in photographs, string lights catching the pale gold of her dress, and she spoke about Desmond as a boy, about the family legacy he was carrying forward, about the Whitfield name and everything it had built across 3 generations, all of it warm and polished and, I noticed, entirely and specifically about her side of the new family. She told a story about Harlan teaching Desmond to sail off Newport when he was 7. She mentioned the vineyard by name, twice. Not once, in 3 full minutes, did she say the words my parents, or even acknowledge, in passing, that a second family existed anywhere in the room at all. She raised her glass at the end and said, to Desmond, and to the beautiful new chapter he's building, and she paused, glass still raised, eyes flicking, just for a half second, toward table 11. Toward the Kowalskis and the strangers and my parents seated quietly among them, with his lovely bride. Not with Renata. Not with our families. With his lovely bride, as though I had arrived at this wedding alone, unaccompanied by any history, any people, any name of my own worth mentioning, materialized fully formed at the altar with no one behind me at all. The room applauded, warm and unaware, glasses lifting all around me, and I sat there for a moment feeling the specific loneliness of being toasted in a way that erased the very people who'd made the toast possible. I looked across the room at table 11. My mother was smiling, clapping along, the practiced, protective smile she'd worn through 2 years of exactly this kind of moment. My father sat very still, his glass raised the polite half-inch required to participate, his face arranged into the same careful neutrality he'd worn at his own engagement dinner when Harlan told him this marriage was a step up. I have never respected him more, and never ached for him more, than in that half-second. I stood up before I'd fully decided to. I want to be honest that it wasn't a plan executed with cold precision, it was a decision my body made a fraction of a second before my mind caught up to it. The way you sometimes discover what you actually believe only in the moment you're forced to act on it. I asked the DJ, quietly, for the microphone, and I told the room, gently, because I did not want to perform anger, I only wanted to tell the truth, that I hadn't planned to speak, but that Corinne's beautiful toast had reminded me of something I wanted to say myself, about the family that had built me long before I ever met a Whitfield. I talked about my father, and I said his name, clearly, into that microphone, in front of every person at that vineyard, Tomas Alves, foreman, who had built half the affordable housing units in 3 counties with his own hands, who had put his daughter through college on a foreman's salary and never once made her feel the cost of it. I said that when I was 14 and needed braces we couldn't afford, he took a second job on weekends pouring concrete, and never once mentioned it to me until years later, in passing, as though it were nothing at all. I talked about my mother, Elena Alves, and I said, plainly, without apology and without flinching, that she cleaned houses for a living, and that she had raised a daughter on that income who stood here now with a master's degree and a career, and that if anyone at this wedding believed cleaning houses was a small thing to have built a life and a family on, they had never once had to build anything themselves from nothing. I said that my mother had taught me to iron a shirt, balance a budget, and hold my head up in rooms that made it clear I wasn't wanted in them, and that every one of those skills had served me exactly as well as anything I'd learned in a classroom. I said that I loved my new family, and that I was grateful for the ones among them. I looked at Desmond when I said this, and meant it, who had never once treated my parents as anything less than exactly what they were, the 2 people who had given me everything I had, including, eventually, the chance to stand in a room like this one at all. I said that legacy wasn't only a vineyard or a name passed down for 3 generations, it was also 2 immigrants building a life from nothing in a country that hadn't made it easy, and raising a daughter who never once had to wonder if she was loved enough to be protected. And then I asked everyone to raise a glass, not to a new chapter, but to the 2 people at table 11 who had built the woman standing at the front of this room, long before any Whitfield legacy had anything to do with her. The room was quiet for a beat too long, and then it wasn't. My cousins started clapping first, then Odalise, then, to my genuine surprise, several people from the Whitfield side of the room I hadn't expected anything from, and within a few seconds the whole vineyard was on its feet, glasses raised toward table 11, where my father sat with his hand pressed briefly, hard, over his mouth, and my mother cried the kind of tears that don't apologize for themselves. Corinne stood frozen near the head table with her own glass still half raised, her face arranged into something polite and unreadable, and Harlan looked, for the first time in 2 years, like a man who had understood he'd been seen doing something he thought no one had noticed. Desmond found me a few minutes later, near the edge of the dance floor, and he didn't say anything for a moment, he just took my hand and held it, and then he said, quietly, "Thank you," which surprised me, because I'd half expected him to be embarrassed, or torn, caught between his mother and me in front of 200 people. He wasn't. He said his mother would probably be frosty about it for a while, and that he'd talk to her, properly this time, not the half conversation we'd had after the seating chart, but he said it without asking me to feel bad about what I'd done, and that mattered more to me than any apology from Corinne ever could have. Corinne did not apologize that night, and I hadn't expected her to. She left the reception a little early, polite and composed to the last, and Harlan stayed until the end but said very little to anyone, moving through the last hour of the evening like a man rehearsing something in his head he wasn't ready to say aloud. Desmond found me near the edge of the dance floor not long after, and he didn't say anything for a moment, he just took my hand and held it, and then he said, quietly, "Thank you," which surprised me, because I'd half expected him to be embarrassed, or torn, caught between his mother and me in front of 200 people. He wasn't. He said his mother would probably be frosty about it for a while, and that he'd talk to her, properly this time, not the half conversation we'd had after the seating chart, but he said it without asking me to feel bad about what I'd done, and that mattered more to me than any apology from Corinne ever could have. What she did, 3 days later, was call my mother directly, not through Desmond, not through me, and invite her to lunch, alone, the 2 of them. I don't know everything that was said at that lunch, because my mother has only ever given me the broad shape of it, protecting me, I think, both Corinne's dignity and her own privacy in equal measure. What she told me was that Corinne had said, stiffly, at first, that she'd been raised to believe that not discussing money or difference was a form of respect, a kind of discretion, and that she was only now understanding it could look, from the other side of the table, like the opposite, like a woman being quietly filed away rather than politely spared. My mother said Corinne's hands had shaken slightly around her water glass while she said it, which was, my mother said, the first genuinely unguarded thing she'd ever seen the woman do. My mother told me she didn't think Corinne had fully arrived at an apology, not yet, but that she'd arrived at the beginning of one, and that for now, that was enough for her to accept the invitation to lunch again next month. I asked my mother, a little disbelieving, why she was willing to give Corinne that chance at all, after 2 years and a seating chart that had tried to hide her among strangers. My mother thought about it and said something I've carried with me since, that she hadn't spent her whole life cleaning other people's houses, on her knees in rooms that weren't hers, to still be the kind of woman who couldn't offer a stranger a second chance at seeing her clearly. That forgiveness wasn't the same as forgetting, and she hadn't forgotten anything. She'd simply decided she wasn't going to let Corinne's smallness make her small in return. Harlan never mentioned the toast to me directly, not that year, but the following Christmas, at a dinner far smaller and quieter than any we'd had before, he asked my father, unprompted, about the town outside Oaxaca he'd grown up in, and actually listened, while my father told him about it, and I watched something shift in the room that had nothing to do with speeches or seating charts at all, just 2 men, finally, having an ordinary conversation neither of them had ever bothered to have before. I think about that vineyard often, and about the 2 years before it, about how long I sat quietly at tables where my parents were being made smaller, telling myself it was manners, telling myself it wasn't personal, telling myself I was protecting the peace. I understand now that peace bought at the cost of your own parents' dignity isn't peace at all. It's just a debt you're deferring, one that eventually, at some table, in front of someone, comes due. I've thought a great deal, in the months since, about why it took me so long to say anything, and I don't think the answer is flattering, but I think it's honest. I think some part of me believed that if I stayed quiet long enough, if I let Corinne have every detail of the wedding she wanted, if I never made anyone uncomfortable, I could earn my parents a place at that family's table through sheer patience and good behavior. I understand now that you cannot earn belonging from people who have already quietly decided you don't have it, no matter how well you behave, no matter how small you make yourself or your family in the process. The only thing that ever actually changed anything was saying the plain truth out loud, once, where it couldn't be managed away or filed under a seating chart. I don't know that anything is fully resolved between our 2 families, even now, and I've stopped expecting it to be. Corinne and I are polite, careful, still finding our way to something honest, one lunch and one Christmas dinner at a time. But my father wears that navy suit to family dinners now without smoothing the lapel first, and my mother has stopped going quiet when someone asks what she does for a living. She tells them, plainly, that she cleans houses, and waits to see who has the grace to be interested in the answer. That, more than any apology, is the thing I actually wanted, and the thing I finally got. If there's anything I'd want another daughter, standing where I once stood, to take from this, it's that restraint has a limit, and it isn't cowardice to find it. I spent 2 years being the bridge between 2 families, absorbing every small slight so the peace could hold a little longer. What I learned, at that vineyard, standing at a microphone I hadn't planned to use, is that some bridges are only worth building once you've made sure both ends are standing on solid ground. If this story stayed with you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more quiet, honest stories.